Good afternoon, everybody. Excuse the slight delay. On behalf of General 𝘮𝘪𝘮 and all of the staff here at the NATO Strategic Direction South Hub, or more simply the Hub, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. And thank you for joining us today for our Southern talks on the climate security, violent extremism nexus in West Africa. My name is Conor Sheedy, and I'm part of the knowledge management team here at the Hub. Today is the fifth of the Hub's Southern Talks, where we invite experts to discuss their perspectives on topics related to peace and security in Africa and the Middle East. If you've not seen our previous Southern Talks, you can find them easily on our YouTube channel, which is at NSD-Hub. This event is also being recorded and will be available for viewing in the next few days. Just a quick reminder that all those registered may send us questions using the chat box during the briefing, which will take up approximately 20 minutes of this upcoming hour, after which there will be an open discussion based on the questions we have received. And so to today's event. We are honored and delighted to have Miss Ebimboere Seiyefa. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah.
Congratulations on Nigeria's win last night, by the way, and getting into the final of the African Nations Cup.
Yeah, I'm still celebrating.
Excellent, excellent. So Ebi, as I believe you prefer to be called, is from Baze University in Abuja. I'm very much looking forward to hear your presentation. But before you begin, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit more fully? And then we can move on to benefiting from your wealth of knowledge and expertise on the topic of climate security and the nexus with violent extremism in West Africa.
Thank you very much. Yes, so my name is Ebimboere Seiyefa, and AB for short, I prefer that. I'm currently a lecturer in Baze University, and I also head the Department of International Relations and Diplomacy in that same university. In addition to that, I'm the head of research for Conflict Research Network West Africa. My areas of interest include, but not limited to, governance for security in West Africa, regional security still within the same region, environmental security. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, it is our pleasure. Absolutely our pleasure. Usually the way we begin is for our expert guest to provide her presentation. So because of a slight technical glitch, we're going to share your presentation with you. Let's do things in a collaborative manner. So just 1 second while we try to pull it up here. Okay. Can you see that now, Ebi?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much.
Off you go, and just give us a nod every time you want us to skip forward a page.
Okay. So, yeah, thank you very much. And so I'll be speaking to you briefly on climate security and violent extremism, and we can move on to slide 3 at this point. So before we go into the conversation of climate change and violent extremism in West Africa, slide 3, I think it would be best if we have just a brief discussion on, an overview of what violent extremism is in West Africa. So I wouldn't be taking you back as far back as pre-colonial or colonial times. So, but ever since the 1960s, different countries in West Africa has faced different forms of insecurity. And more recently, the most recent expression of violent extremism is terrorism, which is something that we have been dealing with. And so several countries in West Africa, in particular the Sahel region, have experienced violent extremism due to the prevalence of weak governance, economic decline, ethno-religious politics, and violent criminal activities. So we move on to slide 4. And so when we talk about violent extremism in West Africa in terms of what drives it, there are so many contemporary drivers that we can draw from. Slide 4, please. And those contemporary drivers that we refer to is associated with the Libyan revolution that added to the increase of the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. And so this happened during the year 2012. And a lot of scholars have argued that due to the revolution that happened in Libya, we now had an increase in weapons being trafficked across the region, and the majority of them made their way down into West Africa. In addition to that, we also had other contemporary drivers, such as the influx of extremists, and non-state armed actors into northern Mali during the Tuareg rebellion in 2012. So note that before 2012, we had the Tuareg rebellion in 1963, in 1990, and 2006. And so these are just some of those factors that, that brood, or rather that drives violent extremism in the region. Likewise, we also have the expansion of Al-Qaeda from South Asia to North Africa, manifested in the Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, which we now saw sustained, or rather led to the emergence of groups like the Movement for Unity and Jihad in West Africa, Ansar-Dine, as well as Boko Haram in Nigeria. And so, in as much as we talk about all these drivers, it is quite it is rather the expansion of violent extremism in West Africa cannot be attributed to a simple factor. So we move to slide 7. Slide 7. So it is complex, it is evolving due to prevailing realities in the region, but yet there are constant themes such as poor or bad governance also manifested in the persistent dynamics of inequality. So again, I'm just going to pause a bit in talking about bad governance. Slide 7 is fine. In bad governance. So yes, we always hear the conversation of bad governance, political instability, the usual issue leading to violent extremism. But I think the aspect of bad governance in direct relation to our conversation, we can explore it from the perspective of how do we respond to insecurity issues in the region, in Nexus governance for security. And yes, climate change is a little bit much more overt. It is silent. You don't see it coming until the damage has been done. But then again, how do we deal with violent extremism? We've always focused from the kinetic measures, military intervention, which is just as important. And these issues will be explored much later in our discourse. Again, another key aspect that we need to explore when we are talking about the overview of violent extremism in West Africa is that we talk about the regional security architecture and what it means for regional security in relation to violent extremism in the region. And this is really important again, because in as much as it's difficult to draw that direct link between climate change and violent extremism, we also have multilateral organizations on board who are supposed to respond to violent extremism. And so we ask ourselves the questions, that particular question, what is our objective in terms of environmental security or in terms of climate change? And all this speaks to the issue that we are talking about. But in spite of that, we have recent scholarship and of course the conversation that we are having at this very moment that underscores that link to climate change. So the possibility of climate change feeding into extremism and actions of extremist groups also feeding into actions that leads to climate change, as will be discussed further. So now we move on to the to a very important part of our conversation. Now we talk about the implications of violent extremism groups to continental and global security. So definitely, in order to properly unpack or discuss this link between climate change and violent extremism, it's very important that we also discuss how violent extremism or violent extremist group impacts on global, continental, and in some cases regional security, or rather in the case of West Africa. So in the last few years, we have seen a rise in military regime, or rather military juntas, and they justify, amongst other reasons, they justify coup as a result of the sustenance of violent extremist groups. So when you look at countries like Burkina Faso, countries like Mali, countries like Niger, you find out that you have a lot of violent extremist groups. In fact, based on data that we saw last year, we realized that we have over 130 active violent extremist groups spread across the West African region. And so the military junta claimed that the existence of this group, due to the inability of the civilian government to curtail the activities, amongst other reasons, led to the forceful seizure of power from civilian governance, which is what we're experiencing at the regional level. As well as that, another implication that we see at the regional and the national level in terms of the implications of this group is that the inability of civilian governments to properly manage or decrease the sustenance or the emergence of this group has led to the development of non-state actors who justify their mobilization as a result of the inability of government to respond to this group. So they come up and then they form armed militia groups to respond to this group. Unfortunately, as we have seen in north-central Nigeria, northwest Nigeria, northeast Nigeria, as well as in Burkina Faso, we have seen these non-state armed actors who are what you would call vigilante groups loosely, becoming a menace to society, also becoming extremists as well. So that is one other implication. Another very popular implication is humanitarian crisis, where you have internally displaced persons, refugees, poverty, as well as increase in illicit activities. Now, without the presence of transnational organized criminal groups, it is very difficult for extremist groups to be sustained because they need these groups to provide certain resources like weapons, for instance, or drugs, for instance. So that is one aspect that we are dealing with. Of course, we also have the incursion of private military companies and its implication for host countries reflected in human rights violations, regime protection, and natural resource exploitation. Slide 11, please. And so, slide 11, please. Thank you. And
I'm sorry,
so
Abby,
you have...
I'm sorry, Abby, we don't have the numbers of the slides.
Okay, all right.
I'm terribly
okay.
sorry. If you could just say forward or backwards, then we won't get
Okay,
to...
all right. So
thank you very much.
Backwards, please. Backwards again. Backwards again. All right, thank you very much. So another implications that we have is that when we have these violent extremist groups in certain host countries or host communities, they tend to control territories that originally belongs to residents of those regions, and majority of those residents are dependent on these territories for source of income. And so you have economic insecurity as being one of those implications. And with economic insecurity could lead to competition for scarce resources, could lead to these individuals being vulnerable to recruitment by this violent extremist group. Now, one other factor that we have that we tend to see that captures the global insecurity issue is the issue of irregular migration to Europe. And this is really, really important because in the last few years, I'm sure you've been watching the news, you've seen this increase in individuals migrating from different parts of Africa through North Africa down to the Mediterranean. And we have seen the implications apart from the how do you call this? Not a plane crash, sorry, when a ship, oh Lord, okay.
A shipwreck.
Apart from sinking, the ship's sinking, apart from that, people dying, trying to cross, you also see that there is this heavy burden, or rather there's this heavy burden on the economies of countries in Europe where these individuals are migrating to. And so you have a whole lot of that with rising nationalism sentiment, etc. So these are very important implications that we trace to violent extremism, and then we also trace as well to climate change driving, or rather sustaining, the activities of violent extremism through the recruitment of foot soldiers. So we move forward to the next slide. Now we get to the very important part of today's conversation, the one that we are all waiting for. And that is the discussion on climate change and violent extremism, the nexus in West Africa. So like I mentioned earlier on, climate change is much more overt in nature. So you don't see it coming, it sneaks up on you, and then you realize that something horrible has happened as a result of climate change. And so it's a threat multiplier. It makes a bad situation worse. I would not go into details about the economic or social or political situation of West African countries. That is already there itself. And climate change makes all these realities worse. So climate change impacts on economic prosperity. And so the agricultural or food economy makes up to about 66% of total employment in the region. And out of that 66%, 70% of those who are involved in agroeconomic activities are small, medium enterprises that rely on climate stability. And so the uncertainty of weather and climate forecasting has made livelihood difficult to sustain, in particular for those in extreme poverty and limited access due to social disparities. So that is one very key aspect that we need to, look at. And when we discuss our case studies, you would see how that lines up in terms of linking climate change and violent extremism. And furthermore, climate change also contributes to existing conflict, especially around natural resources. And this has been largely manifested in the farmers' herders clash in Nigeria, which we would also explore. So we move forward. So still on climate change and violent extremism, the nexus in West Africa. So another very important link that we need to focus on is resource competition. And Burkina Faso is a very good example to have this conversation, because in Burkina Faso, we have a variety of violent extremist groups, and most of them are focused on ethnic supremacy, and others are focused on a response to ethnic supremacy as well. So you have a combination of these two going on there. And yes, there are other pre-existing conditions that has led to this violent competition between these ethnic groups, but one of them has to do with land, competition for land, which is becoming scarce due to rising temperatures in Burkina Faso, manifested in droughts and making arable lands non-arable, in addition to reducing grazing fields for cattle or for any other source of animal husbandry there. Another nexus we see is livelihood insecurity. Nigeria is a very good example, and in the last 2-3 years, we have been dealing with the farmer herders clash, which has been going on for quite some time. And again, we are going to explore this when we talk about our Lake Chad case study. A very key point in linking up the in drawing the nexus between climate change and violent extremism in the region is recruitment. And herein lies the strength of our argument, in the sense that a lot of individuals become displaced and unemployed due to climate change, and they become vulnerable to recruitment by violent extremist group. And you see it in Niger, in Chad, in Nigeria, in Mali, in Burkina Faso as well. So majority of these individuals are dependent on agroeconomic activities. And when they're unable to farm their lands or unable to feed their cattle due to rising temperatures, due to droughts, it makes it difficult for them to earn a source of living. And so they are left with limited choices, either to migrate to other parts of the country or the continent and compete for already scarce resources, or they find themselves being recruited to these violent extremist groups. And and the other choice, which is not so attractive as well, is to also join transnational organized criminal groups. So these are very crucial factors. And one of the things that sustains violent extremist group is having a sustained inflow of foot soldiers. So without having people running logistics, people serving as mercenaries for the groups, or people just serving as messengers of whichever aspects, whichever tasks being assigned to these groups, it's difficult for this group to be sustained, because you need human beings to run these groups. And of course, there's also that link to irregular migration. So these vulnerable individuals become foot soldiers for extremist groups in other parts of the region and Africa. So not just in West Africa. So you see them moving or migrating from one state to another, looking for some source of income, and then they become vulnerable. And so we move forward to our next slide, where we discuss climate change and violent extremism in the Nexus, but this time around, we are focused on our case studies. So we'll start with Mali. Now, Mali is a very interesting case study. Northern Mali, for quite some time, has been dealing with a combination of different factors. More importantly, you have the bad governance aspect of it. But then again, you also have the impact of climate change. A large population of individuals who live in Northern Mali are dependent on agro-economic activities, where animal husbandry takes a large share of source of income there. And in the last, 10 to 15 years, we have had climate change impacts reflected in droughts. And so without having access to water or fed or grazing ground, it's difficult to continue the business of animal husbandry. And of course, you also have the sustained issues between the central government in Mali and individuals in northern Mali, leading to separatist and secessionist groups. So when individuals are unable to access income, if and when they do decide to migrate to other parts of Mali, they still have to compete for economic resources with those people there. And also, there's also the aspect of skill sets. Some do not have the necessary skill sets to cope. Some are only, their skill set is only limited to what they know, agricultural activities or animal husbandry in the case of northern Mali. And so they become vulnerable to membership in any of these groups. Not that they actually believe in the ideologies per se, but they are looking for a steady source of income. And it all, dates back to the same issue of climate change impacts on their source of income. Now we move on to our second case study, which is the Lake Chad region. And in the Lake Chad region, we're talking about the border communities in Nigeria, in Niger, in Cameroon, in Chad. Yeah, those 4 countries in particular. And so we notice that the Lake Chad it's very, very important. You have 2 core rivers, one coming from the Congo and one coming from Cameroon. And these rivers feed into Lake Chad. Now, due to rising temperature as well as man-made activity, when you look at the Lado Dam in Cameroon that feeds into the Lake Chad region, we see that there is a shrinking of the lake. Now, the Lake Chad region, you have different groups of, different economic groupings there. So you have the fishermen or women. You also have those who are into ferry transport. You have the farmers who rely on sourcing water from the Lake Chad region for irrigation. And then you also have the pastoralists as well, the animal husbandry individuals. So each of these groups are dependent on the Lake Chad for source of income. And so you have the Lake Chad shrinking in size, and then you also have increased competition in addition to the other existing social, political, and economic realities there. What we have is violent competition. But one of the key manifestations that we have in the case of the border communities is the competition between the herders and the farmers. Now, from what we know about history, for quite some time, the Sahel region and sub-Saharan Africa were once filled with forests, greenery, and of course, crops for animals to feed on. And the unique culture of animal husbandry in the region is we are just slowly transitioning into the ranching system. It has always been free range or free grazing is what we've always had. And so you have had this consistent movements of people and their cattle coming from the Sahel region down to northern Nigeria, and more recently coming into the central and the southern part of Nigeria. And of course, you have other factors like overpopulation as well. And so you have this competition between the farmers and the herders, more recently expressed in violence. And again, another very important aspect that we also need to highlight in the Lake Chad region is that we have this resurgence, not really resurgence, we have this emergence of what we call in Nigeria, terror bandits. So you have individuals who are now involved in kidnapping people in very brutal ways. There is torture, there is execution of these people, and of course, also holding the dead bodies for ransom. And based on eyewitness accounts, or rather former hostages that we've spoken with, as well as officers, police officers and security officers who have interacted with some of these kidnappers, a majority of them were actually involved in agricultural activities. Of course, you could argue that greed could be part of the motivation, but most of the argument is the fact that climate change has made it difficult for them to earn a decent source of living. And so what is open for them is to either join ISWAP or Boko Haram or become terror bandits. And so this is one of the links that we see regarding climate change and violent extremism, and when we focus on the nexus. So we move on to the next slide, where we talk about climate change and multilateral policy response to violent extremism. And this is really, really important in our conversation. So in as much as we have been able to argue to a certain point that there is a link between climate change and the sustenance of violent extremism in the region, we also need to talk about the responses. And so we start with the multilateral response. And so far, so good. At the international level, we have had collaborations from foreign allies. And so this has ensured the intervention of foreign involvement, for instance, manifested in funding, equipment, training, and intelligence support. And then we've actually worked with the United Nations, the EU, and in particular, France. France has been known to deploy troops to work with regional militaries and directly engage with these extremist groups. But despite foreign involvement, the issue of violent extremism still persists in the region. So in addition as well, we also have this recent rising nationalism, which has led to the withdrawal of active or military foreign involvement in counterterrorism and COIN measures there. And if you could recall where I mentioned the issue of military juntas there, and that in particular also affects the response to violent extremism. Of course, at the regional level, we have ECOWAS, Multinational Joint Task Force, and the G5. So the last two I just mentioned, their activities are kind of constrained now due to what we're experiencing in the region. So I think ECOWAS is really, really having a horrible week, if I say so myself. I mean, in the last, 1 week or so, we've had Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali announcing their withdrawal from ECOWAS. And Niger has been quite instrumental. Niger, working with Nigeria, has been quite instrumental in confronting or engaging with violent extremist groups. So this is a very important aspect of it. But the reason why I cited all this different multilateral response is not so much to critique them per se, but just to highlight one missing ingredient in their response strategy, which is the inclusion of climate change. Because even if you want to respond to a particular insecurity threat, or security threat rather, or insecurity event, it's important to look at the root causes and other factors that contribute to the sustenance of that threat. And so these kinetic measures, which are very good, by the way, or we could always have, could always discuss that in a different conversation, excludes climate change. And that is really important in our conversation. So we move forward. Excuse me. We move forward, where we now talk about the challenges and the shortcomings of the responses. And I think I've already alluded to that already. So not having a holistic framework that includes climate change response is very, very important. And more importantly, every violent extremist group is quite unique in their environment. There are different factors that drives them, or different forms of outcomes of climate change. Some could be as a result of drought, some could be as a result of rising sea temperature, some could be as a result of flooding or mudslides, etc. So this is really, really important when we are trying to come up with a framework on how to respond to climate change. Now, it's very important that we take into cognizance that we do have amazing, beautiful documents on climate change. So we have a lot of climate change policy, but it seems to run parallel to our counterinsurgency or counterterrorism strategy. So this is part of the issues that we're dealing with in terms of our challenges and shortcomings. So we moving forward to the next slide. And so we find that even when we have discussions on climate change in the region, we are always focused on addressing it through mitigation, very important adaptation. And these are really important aspects of focusing on climate change. But instead, what if we adopt an approach that focuses on helping individuals to adapt, prepare, and respond to future climate events. That will make it easier. So that because climate change, whether we like it or not, it is here to stay. And we are going to be dealing with climate change for decades to come, or to the end of time. And so it's very important that we help, or rather we train individuals who are dependent on agro-economic activities, especially here in the West African region, on how to adapt to climate change. So that when it happens, when they begin to feel the impact of climate change, they do not have to serve as foot soldiers to sustain violent extremist groups. And so we move on to the way forward. So what do we do? How do we respond to violent extremism? And that is the next slide. So the answer already lies in the challenges which we have just briefly discussed. So we need to develop a COIN or CT response that is specific to the violent groups as well, that speaks to the socioeconomic political realities, in particular the environmental realities of this region, in this case, West Africa. And so we need meaningful engagement with foreign allies, such as the UN, EU, and NATO in addressing climate change issues. And I know that NATO has been at the very forefront of that. I think 2 years ago or so, and I stand corrected, please, they developed a climate change security agenda or reports. So, and I think it's quite interesting how NATO is moving, or rather not moving away, expanding from training soldiers to engage during, extreme weather conditions, to now looking at ways on how to deal with the issue of climate change. And therein lies where we can have meaningful engagement. So what we need to do is that we need to go back to the grassroots, to the community level, where we have this violent extremist group recruiting members to join them. So we need to go back to the grassroots level and then train these individuals on how to adapt and prepare for climate change, so that when their source of income is being affected, it is easy for them to be resilient and not become vulnerable to recruitment, and recruitment being the major way in which violent extremist groups are being sustained. So thank you very much, and looking forward to your feedback and your questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Ebi. That was very comprehensive, very interesting. I'm impressed that you managed to do that so patiently with us trying to hop forwards and backwards.
Yes.
You must be still on a high after the victory in yesterday's soccer match.
Oh yeah, I am. I am so happy. Still celebrating. Looking forward to Sunday when we take the
Yes, the very best of luck. I missed the other semi-final, but being a Naples fan, I have to say I was happy to see Victor Osimhen healthy and fit and playing. Anyway, to get back to the thing, was the climate response for sustaining peace that you mentioned, the document that was signed at COP27 2 years ago involving the African Union, is that what you were referring to?
Yeah, one of the documents, yeah. One of our beautifully crafted documents.
So I have a question. While we're just looking through the questions that were already sent into the chat box, unfortunately, I couldn't see them while we were sharing the presentation. So just get to that in a moment. Is the local perspective, do people that you would be talking to, you meet and are they frustrated by hearing so many promises in relation to how to fix the issue of climate crisis and keep the temperature below 1.5, even though today we've pretty much failed in that regard? Is there a sense of frustration and anger, considering the fact that, Africa is basically responsible for maybe only 4 or 5% of the natural, or of the gases that are causing the greenhouse effect, etc.? Absolutely.
At the intergovernmental level, I mean, when you watch or read the reports of I think it was COP28 or so that we had last year, you could literally hear the frustration. And I think at the governmental level, most of the solution for them lies in more money being given to African countries to actively combat this issue. But then again, at the subnational level, in terms of those who are directly involved in agricultural activities, their frustration is quite different. They argue that a lot of people come in, ask them questions about climate change, about mitigation, and then they have training in terms of adapting, but that does not necessarily translate into the realities that they are dealing with in terms of climate change. So, of course, there is that support in terms of funding. Okay, for example, now, a lot of women are involved in agricultural activities in the West African region. And I really don't want to go into the conversation of gender inequalities of disparities, but those are real realities that these individuals are dealing with. They do not have access to funds. And so for them, the best way to adapt is to do multiple planting, which is quite expensive for them. Normally, you plant once and then you harvest and then you sell. And so they've had to change the kind of crops that they would sell normally just to adapt to climate change, but it doesn't necessarily help at the end of the day. Because what they want to see is funding. More importantly, what they also want to see is investment in the agricultural sector, whereby they don't have to rely on climate change or weather stability to produce food crops. So the frustration at the governmental level is money from the developed countries or asking them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And then at the grassroots level, they need support in terms of real active, effective training, not just coming and then talking to them for like 2-3 days of workshop and then you go away. No, they want you to stay with them, teach them how to be resilient to this, and also provide loans, in particular for those who are the small scale enterprise level. So that is basically what we have been getting from the communities who are affected by climate change here.
Okay, and from your extremely good presentation, I noticed that the issue of unemployment and reduced agro-economic activity is one of the most important areas that is suffering, and it seems to be equally exacerbated, worsened by violent extremist groups and climate change. Do you think that's the same across the board, across West Africa being such an incredibly huge area? Or is it possible that in order to come up with the sort of holistic approach as a solution that you're mentioning, it needs to be tailored very differently in each area?
Absolutely. So it's when you look at it from a broad perspective, it seems like it's the same issue across the region. I mean, climate change broadly, countries are affected, in particular, the landlocked countries are more affected than the coastal region or the coastal areas from what we have seen so far. But then again, different countries have different impacts. In the case of Burkina Faso has this issue of grazing lands being reduced, and northern Mali as well, they have similar issues, and that is due to rising temperature. So we see that being manifested there as well. So when we think of how do we respond to, it's very important to find out, number one, what are the climate conditions that we experience what are the unique climate conditions that we experience in each of these countries or each of these regions. Now, for us in Nigeria, our rainfall, yes, I know in the last 2 or 3 years, there seem to be a bit of a delay before the rain comes, but the rain still comes and we seem to be doing fairly well. But where we are being impacted it's from the Sahel region, because individuals in the Sahel region, already their grazing lands are already disappearing due to extreme weather conditions in terms of drought. And so you have these cattle headers coming down from up north, coming down into Nigeria, and then having to compete for our arable land resources with the farmers as well. So these are some of the issues that we face. So yes, we need to tailor a holistic framework specific to the unique climate impacts in these countries. Oh yes, and again, you also mentioned recruitment. Sorry, I almost forgot about the second part of the question. So for recruitment, and therein lies the crux of my arguments, recruitment is very, very important. Without people being recruited into violent extremist groups, those groups will die. They will not be sustained. And so when people are not able to adapt or look for ways of responding to climate change and its impact on their source of livelihood, they become vulnerable to recruitment by these groups. And of course, in the presentation, I forgot to expand on one other aspect, which has to do with territories being captured. And we see this in North Central and Northwest Nigeria. You have these violent extremist groups capturing arable farmlands, which on a normal good day, if they were not there, individuals will go to farm, they would harvest crops, they would sell said crops, and then there'll be money in their pockets. So these groups are there, they capture these territories, and in order to have access to these territories, you might have to decide to be recruited by them. And then they are there, and there's a level of over farming because we are still very much a bit conservative in our farming system, not very, very highly industrialized. So we have this, what is the word they taught me when I was in high school? This fallow farming, whereby you farm for a period of years, 6 years on a plot of land, and then you leave it to rest for like 1 or 2 years before you go back. That doesn't happen anymore due to climate change conditions, shrinking arable or farmable lands, and also this violent extremist group capturing this land for their use, and hence also creating a market for foot soldiers to sustain their activities.
Thank you. Thank you. That's excellent. I have a couple of questions here from Lieutenant Colonel Narducci. Thank you for the interesting and comprehensive briefing. I would like to know, in which practical ways do you believe NATO could come into the issue at the local level? And then moving on, a second question, the substitution effect from farmer to member of a violent extremist group is sensibly affecting the overall availability of produce, of food?
Okay, so to start with the first question in terms of how can NATO come in, when we look at NATO's engagement with Africa, it's much more kinetic. I know there was a particular time when we were dealing with piracy in the African region, if I recall clearly. So we had NATO coming in and helping to train and also patrol the waters as well. So I think where we can have more meaningful collaboration is at the AU level. Definitely, that is a start at the AU level. And this has to do with our Green Wall initiative, which we started decades ago, and then we stopped, and now we are trying to resuscitate that. So NATO has been quite active in terms of kinetic measures, which is training soldiers on how to engage with extremist groups in extreme weather conditions. And that is good, because we need that as well, being that climate change is yet to stay. But when we look at it from the perspective in terms of at the local level, now this is where our Green Wall initiative comes into play. So we don't need the money, we need funding, but more importantly, we also need experts, because I'm pretty much sure that NATO has resources in terms of human capital development, individuals who are very well versed on how do you make the best out of nothing, so to speak? How do you adapt to, how do you still produce food, or how do you feed your animals in extreme weather conditions? So those are one of the ways that we can have those engagements at the rural levels. Now, the participants made a very interesting observation regarding food insecurity, and it's something that we are actually dealing with right now, not just in Niger, but also in Nigeria as well, directly linked to the activities of these violent extremist groups. They capture territories and they sit on these territories. Farmers are afraid to go back to farm. And this is part of it. And this is actually where we now argue that climate change, that the activities of these extremist groups also feeds into climate change. And what this means is that when you capture large swaths or large lands of arable land, it's difficult for farmers to farm. So farmers are now limited to a few acres of land. And then there's what you call over farming. So whereby the topsoil is eventually destroyed. Add that as well, and that is still part of climate change at the end of the day. In addition to that, not being able to farm in your preferred farming land, you are being pushed more into the forest, and so illegal logging comes in. So many trees are being cut, are being destroyed, and we need the trees. We need the trees to serve as windbreaker, to serve as a barrier to mudslides, and also to help to protect the topsoil, the arable soil, for further farming. So you have over farming, illegal logging already feeding back into climate change conditions. So yes, definitely food production has gone down as a result of these groups.
Sorry. Okay, very good. And following on from that, another question. You mentioned improving and educating people's resilience to climate shocks, as you were just saying now as well. Do the monitoring and early warning processes need to be improved in order to support this? And if so, how could NATO and the West better assist these early warning processes?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. I know that we do have early warning processes, although majority of these processes are being focused on more overt forms of insecurity in the region. However, looking at collaboration between NATO and countries in Africa, I think that is good in terms of intelligence gathering. When I say intelligence, I mean data on climate conditions in the region. So it will be good for them to share this data with our regional governments. But again, looking at it more at the grassroots level, for people who would actually benefit from all of these high level conversations or agreements or treaties, it is better for us to okay, sorry, I'm going far ahead. So at the regional, national, and subnational levels, we have organizations, some are startups, some are NGOs who are actually working tirelessly to mitigate climate change, providing training sessions, but their activities are being hampered to a certain degree or being constrained due to resources and of course access to this data. Yes, we have, ministries that are involved with weather meteorological ministries there that read temperature patterns, etc. We have those, but I think if we can collaborate with NATO in terms of providing this data as well as expertise at the local level, that would be great. So at the AU level, yes, we go on with the Green Wall Initiative, absolutely good. Funding, that is good, but at the level where we need it, we need partnerships with NGOs and private companies who are working hard towards mitigating, as well as farmers. Let's not forget about the farmers. So the farmers, the small, medium enterprise farmers also need that support, whether it's in funding, but more importantly, in capacity building, training, as well as equipment to better adapt and respond to climate change impacts.
Well, certainly after this event, I'm sure we can talk more about which organizations are the most appropriate, and then see if there are more practical steps that can be taken, at least from our end, to understand better exactly who and what is being done there. You mentioned the grassroots. I'm curious, and this is personally me. Do people across West Africa feel that the help is there for them, and that there is a desire from the global north, from the West, to do what can be done, if at all possible, both in relation to combating violent extremism and also to mitigate and perhaps improve resilience to the effects of the climate crisis? Do they feel that? Do they know it?
That is very, very good, because I know last year I was giving a talk in Dakar about gender and climate change. And while I was preparing for that talk, and as well after the talk, based on more interaction, realized that when you go to the field and then you discuss with people about climate change, they are not aware of all these beautiful treaties that we talk about. They're not aware of it. They have no idea about these treaties, these agreements. They have no idea. And so as far as they are concerned, nobody cares about, the struggles that they have dealing with extreme weather conditions. So they do not know. And therein lies part of the problem. And so they are surprised when they say, oh, there's actually a national action plan for climate change. Really? So they are surprised. And that also comes in, and it's still a gap that we are working in at the national level, that communication regarding climate change. Now, in terms of violent extremism, well, is a mixture of both, because I've had different conversations with experts who go into the field to talk to people at the community level who are victims of violent extremist groups. So on the one hand, they're like, okay, United Nations, they come and go, but National Joint Task Force, they come and go, not necessarily getting rid of this violent extremist group. And our soldiers, well, when they stay with us, they can be a bit, exploitative. They can be a bit violent. So the reactions are mixed. And so while they are happy to actually see real, or rather physical engagement with these extremist groups, they are expecting something more than physical engagement. They're expecting a whole framework whereby the community can be rebuilt and they could have constant patrols or security in that region. Because in some points, the multinational joint task force would go in, recapture these territories, people are asked to come back home, and then they leave. And when they leave, the extremists will come back again, and then it's a vicious circle. So in terms of violent extremism, there is that understanding that at the international or regional or national level, there is engagement, which they can see. But for them, it goes beyond that military intervention processes that we have been engaging in the last, give or take 10 years.
Thank you. Yes, that's unfortunately what I feared you might say. Obviously, it's not easy from any perspective to try and find a solution to such an array of interconnected problems and difficulties. I think one of the things that one of the common misunderstandings is that Africa obviously is a country which has always had issues of drought and floods and weather like everywhere else in the world. But that isn't an argument to suggest that climate crisis and an increasing temperature is not making things extensively worse and seriously hampering the lives and livelihoods of so many people. There are still people who want to argue that it doesn't exist. What is the hope across the board of people who have been farmers or indeed herders, even though they're arguing and fighting with each other and the conflict has been going on for a long time?
Yeah.
Clearly, nobody deliberately seeks conflict when they're just trying to farm their land or herd their animals.
So, okay, so I think there is one important factor that has to be brought into the mix of the conversation. And so, like we discussed earlier on, climate change is one of those enemies that just sneaks up on you. You don't see it coming. And in the case of West Africa, we have been dealing with more overt forms of insecurity. This one, we're literally saying it's people being snatched off the streets, people being shot, people being killed. And so a lot of the attention from both the victims of climate change as well as the government is focused on these more overt forms of insecurity threats. But yes, climate change is a conversation that we've been having in the last 5 years in our region. We have accepted that it has always been there, but is now beginning to make matters worse, or rather exacerbates the existing issues that we have been dealing with. And so the hope, I would say, is that perhaps when the government is done dealing with the physical or the more overt forms of insecurity, we will be able to deal with, with climate change. But more importantly, the other hope is technology. So there is this call, there is this in the last 2-3 years, there has been this persistent call for, okay, maybe it's about time that we now deviate or we move towards highly industrialized farming. Ranching, for instance, we've been having the ranching conversation in Nigeria for quite some time. Of course, it was politicized and, that is still ongoing. So there is this movement towards more mechanized form of agricultural activity. And so we are looking at foreign direct investment as one of the means of getting that done. But more importantly, we're also looking to the government to provide agricultural loans. Of course, we have also pursued, during the former administration, there was a government policy on agricultural loans that was not properly handled, and also in the midst of insecurity, that didn't really fall through. So, having these groups makes it difficult for us to focus more on climate change resilience approaches. But, having the conversation is a start. And I believe firmly that talking about it is a step in the right direction in terms of how we can include mechanized agricultural activities, especially for the small, medium farmers or small, medium enterprises that we have there.
Yes, I completely agree. Corruption is something that affects the entire world, but that shouldn't be a reason to stop trying. Just because something doesn't work the first time doesn't mean you don't keep trying. If it's the right thing to do, you keep doing it.
You keep pushing. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I mean, people's lives are at stake, and there is a better future for us all if we make the right effort together. Ebby, this has been outstanding. I have to say, I've enjoyed every minute of it.
Thank you very much.
On behalf of all of the staff and here and my team, our team, I'm just the face. They do all the work, believe me. I would like to thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure. Just a quick reminder to everybody who has been watching that this event will be available online in the next few days on our YouTube channel, which is at NSD-S- or -hub. I thank you so much again, Ebby. I thank everybody else for watching, and I look forward to seeing you at our next Southern Talks. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.